Hey, folks, welcome back to another episode of the Change Physician Podcast. This is your host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro, with my fabulous co-host, Dr. Melissa Cady, and returning guest, Dr. Rip Patel, and one of the favorites, the heartthrob, as they call him.
I'll pay you later for that.
And we sort of introduced this episode because we had all these topics, and just like, I think this happens all the time, something occurred just before we began, except this didn't occur just before this episode. But what is it called? What do you guys call it down in Texas?
I heard someone say Snowzilla.
Snowzilla.
Snowpocalypse.
Yeah. So if you're watching this or listening to this later and you don't remember February of 2021 and the absolute cold front that smashed into Texas and caused havoc, that's what we're going to be talking about, because two of our presenters, or at least our chatters on today's episode, both live in Texas. So you're going to have a direct firsthand version of what it was like to go through that, as well as some healthcare perspectives on what it was and how, what was it like to be a physician in the middle of when everything kind of goes to hell. So I'm looking forward to it, because my house was warm the whole time and I had water and energy and all that. So
I think we should hear Rip's perspective and what he endured, and then I'll chime in and let you know what I had to do myself. So Rip, what happened with you with this whole thing?
Where do you start? I mean,
yeah.
Before I did emergency medicine, I talk a lot about how I was going to do general surgery. And I was told in general surgery, don't miss a shift unless you're going to die. And even if you're dead, you better come up for your shift. And so I hammer that into my residents a lot, not because I want them to never come in ill but I'm like, people rely on you, you're an important provider. And so I was terrified because, I had to go, I was working up in College Station and not coming in for a shift. Now there is a little better coverage on the ER, but you're still leaving somebody dry. And I've been left dry, and it is the most painful, horrific feeling. So, I drove up Thursday night, despite my parents and loved ones and loved one. Let me not say loved one. I don't know how many people actually care about it, but one person, they were like, don't do it. And I'm like, I don't have an option. I mean, really, because the roads up there are just as bad. And so I lost water, power, of course. I'm trying to get food. And there was one place right by my house. It's called Cowboys and Indians. It's a play on the Indian restaurant. I'm not going to comment on the quality of the Indian food, but anyway, I think I waited 3.5 hours to get my food just because they were so overwhelmed. And so I got on the road late. I almost killed myself driving, which is the really part I got most upset with myself about, because I was on I-10 here in Houston driving, and the roads looked okay. So I was going about 10, 20, 30, people going faster. I felt more confident, but there were just random ice slicks on the highway. And, I hit one and then 360'd on the highway. And then my car started just veering that way and almost crashed into another car that was in a spin as well. So then I was mortified, got off the highway. This is like at 10 o'clock at night. And I took the back roads, which was even dumber because they were completely iced. So I was going about 5 miles per hour. And I was going about 5 miles of, a 1 hour and 10-minute drive took me about 4.5 hours. And that was failing. So I got back on the highway. I stopped for a minute. It was midnight. I looked up. I was in the middle of a cornfield. And I'm like, where did my life go wrong? Why am I sitting here in a cornfield in the middle of Texas in an ice storm trying to get to work? But it made me sad because I normally try not to get too sad, but I'm like, I already had COVID. That was terrible. The pandemic was terrible. And now this goddamn ice storm. I'm like, how much more is this going to go? Just take me. Like, I'm good, man. Like, let me go. Anyway, I got back on the highway. They'd actually salted the 6, which goes up to College Station, and I made it. But it was just terrible. It's so devastating, embarrassing. I live in the energy capital of the world, and we lost power. And by the way, people are still, without power, without water. My poor maid came today and she hasn't had water for days. There are no plumbing supplies here. So that was a brief tidbit of me. I'll tell the rest to my therapist, later. So
Can I ask you both a question though, to kind of frame this up front is, like day, there's always like in the movies, there's a day and everybody's going to the park and the dogs are running around, the kids are playing frisbee or whatever, and everything's fine. And then something happens. So when did you guys realize that things weren't right? This is looking a little bit worse than I was anticipating.
Go ahead, Rip. Or you want me to chime in?
Yeah, you go for it. I have to think about that one.
Yeah. So interestingly, my husband is like my other part of my brain, like the things to pay attention to that a lot of times you get like, consumed by your work or whatever. He's always good at, he forwards me emails of news that I need to know about, or he'll inform me, I think the weather might not be so good, and the cloud formation and the way the fronts, he's always into that. So even before, I think Friday night was when things started kind of going bad, the first hit of the cold front. And so Thursday, he had said, I think we should, go run these errands. So we went ahead and we went to stores and got stuff way before people realized how bad, truly bad this was going to be. And so, and luckily we had already kind of, good old Costco and places like that, we tend to get some things like some flavored waters in large supply anyway. So we had already we probably had a month worth of food that we could live off of, and waters. So that helped us. So that was around the time that we started thinking this is not going to be good. But until you saw the 7 inches of snow all around our house, it's not really real. But that was kind of the time frame.
Yeah. Right. I missed the boat twice. I missed the boat with COVID because I knew COVID was coming. I just didn't realize how crazy people were going to get.
Yeah.
And the storm was the same way. I have so many other things going on in my life. I'm just like, oh, well, and I missed that boat too. And I knew the roads were dangerous, but when there were no groceries, when I was waiting at the gas station for an hour to get gas, it really hit home. And, I was at work and the power went out, and I was working the whole shift. And obviously the cafeteria crew can come in. So the doctors and nurses and everybody, janitors were all like eating crackers and water. And but the part that scared me was I couldn't see if my home was flooded, because I couldn't see. I have some, cameras in the house and stuff, and I was just expecting my house was flooded. I had no clue. Which brings me back to this, like, don't get attached to material goods, except that I really like my house a lot. But I missed the boat. I really, I made it's a wake up call to me, but yeah, I should have. And during the ice storm before, I was driving the med center and I had to go through the roads, and I made about 5 miles per hour, and I made it, but it was just really, really dangerous.
Yeah. So I guess the generator kicked on and the hospital was okay at that point.
Yeah. Our hospital was good. Thank God. But I'm not sure how it is up there for y'all, but in Houston, like I said, there's still tons of people without water, power. And I had, some people come to my house, like electrician came to fix like some outlets and stuff. And he was like, there were like blocks and blocks of people waiting at the plumbing stores just for basic parts, because they were just going to try to do it themselves. Right. I had, a really stupid issue. So I was just about plumbing. So I was just curious how long it'd take to get a plumber. I think we called over 20 people. A few people most of them didn't even pick up, by the way. Yeah. And I think they were going to say at least 2 weeks to get plumber. And so we were all just like, look, we're okay. We'll be fine. Cold water is not a big deal. We'll be fine.
Yeah. What's interesting is that, so I had no water for 5 days. So hence no shower and hence the adjustment in not doing heavy sweaty workouts or anything. So modified lifestyle. Electricity, they did rotating blackouts. So we had 2 hours off. And then there was another time the following night that was off for like 30 minutes. But there were definitely people that had, if it wasn't part of those like 2 hour windows, they had something legit happen that actually created a power outage. That I think there's still some people with some residual problems that are still having issues with, whether it's water or electricity, whatever those delayed repairs might have been. But what's interesting is some of the patients that when I was that week, they completely shut down the surgery center. So they had problems with getting water. So they couldn't autoclave and sterilize surgical instruments.
Oh, wow. I didn't think about that.
Yeah. So they were kind of dependent on that. And then they had to run cycles, make sure that it was, appropriately sterilized and actually was going through the cycle. It was dependable. So that whole time. But when I got back to doing procedures, you know, some of the patients, you know, I'm like, oh, how are you doing after this past week? And several people, they were, the part of the grid that they were on was located near a hospital or located near. So there was, you know, it's interesting. You find out through these things that you happen to live in an area that's prioritized to have electricity or water. So things are tended to a little faster there for a lot of these public services and whatnot. So even looking at from above, from drones or cameras in the city, there's discrepancies on where the lights were on during it at night. That was the most revealing. Like the east side, which is, you know, notoriously been more of the lower socioeconomic, which that's been changing over the last few years, but versus a certain area of Austin has all its lights on. I think it's probably around some of those important hospitals and whatnot, but there's definitely a distinct difference on experiences. And some people had like this guilt that they never were without water or electricity, despite everyone else around them that was, you know, snowed in and blacked out.
It was really sad. A lot of people were, I mean, here, and after I finished my shift, I was like, I'm starving. I haven't eaten anything all day except a few crackers. So there's one place in College Station, bless their hearts, they stayed open and were serving food to people. But I mean, I think the sentiments were the same. You know, big city Houston, rural, you know, central, mid-central Texas is like, everybody's angry. You see the skylines are all lit up and the suburbs and the low-income areas are not. And why are the skyscrapers all getting power, whatever part of the grid they're on? But I mean, like, give me a break. It's just it's mortifying seeing friends with kids sleeping by fireplaces. And my friend worked at one of the big hospitals here in the medical center, and they were using buckets of water to flush the toilets.
I had to do that.
Yeah. I mean, so
crazy. So did you see a lot of carbon monoxide poisonings?
You know, my good friends here are the toxicologists at Baylor, and they were actually sending out messages to all of us on the listserv about how to manage carbon monoxide poisoning, because so many people were so desperate and doing, and by the way, included which my parents, who were like sitting in the car. My dad's a doctor, by the way. Sorry, Dad, if you're watching this. Sitting in the car, bless his heart, he's trying to call us to let us know he's okay. But he's sitting in the car running the gas in a closed garage, heating himself up, talking to me. And I'm like, Dad, where are you? He's like, don't worry about it. I'm like, where are you? He's like, in the garage. I'm like, do you have the car on? He's like, yes. I'm like, Dad, like, come on, you know, this is really dangerous. He's like, I'll be fine.
Yeah.
But yeah, they saw a lot of carbon monoxide toxicity. It was very interesting. And we saw in the ER, we were seeing a lot of slips and falls. Elderly people dehydrated, just really sad stuff. Yeah. And
for those listening, I mean, Texas is I'm not going to get into politics or anything, because that could go in circles, but you know, ERCOT has been predominantly, Texas is like on its own grid, wants to be independent, I guess, from the federal grid, but there's El Paso and I think Beaumont that had some capture of other parts of the national grid. So they didn't have these issues, you know, so I think it's interesting that there's a lot of political and other, you know, other things that probably contributed to the situation. Granted, this is extraordinarily rare occurrence to have a whiteout in Texas all at once. So were you aware of that?
Yeah, you know, I wasn't. I've learned so much about this whole thing. I think El Paso, I want to say, is part of, like, there's like the East Coast and the West Coast grid. And I had no idea how any of this worked. I didn't realize too that you could also not have your rate set. So you could be like at the mercy of market rates based on demand and supply and get these. I mean, so people are now in Houston are facing these bills they could never in a million years afford.
Right.
On top of which, like, no water, burst pipes, and then thousands of dollars in bills coupled with, it's just really devastating. You know, I was going to say, like, people's true colors come out here. I mean, again, nothing political here, but, you know, our Texas senator left the state. That's not an opinion, that's a fact. He left the state and somehow didn't realize that was not a good idea when his constituents are suffering. Versus, I don't know if you saw, you know, I grew up in Houston, Mattress Mac of Gallery Furniture. He does this big thing. He's like, what is it? Money, we really will save you money. And he shows you like a little money thing. He's been around since like the 70s, I think, but he opened up his furniture store and used it as a shelter and let people sleep there. I mean, so it brings out people's true colors and in a really, really dark time.
Yeah.
Well, it does. It reveals the character underneath, like that's sort of the crisis and stress sort of reveals in a lot of different ways. And it kind of makes me think about when we did the COVID episode, when you came on the same way, we were supposed to do an episode and you're like, oh, I just had this and we had these experiences with COVID and we sort of did that one.
Yeah.
And, the leadership example, because at that point in time was when the vaccine was just coming out and you're like, you know what, our CEO of the hospital said, I am going to delay my vaccination because I know this is something that the frontline people need. And that's a point of character, right? Not using your point of privilege in a way to get yourself extra benefits, but recognizing that in those crisis opportunities or crisis moments, that you as a leader are supposed to support those who need you. And I do think, because you see this stuff that's coming out and there's these heroic stories. Like I saw the story about the guy with the furniture store. And there's, they had pictures where these people who had been probably, I mean, I would say it's going to sound like I'm almost being dramatic, but people are freezing to death and they're in his store and there's families like on these lazy boy chairs, literally having a safe place where they can stay warm. That is a big deal. So anyway, I don't know who Mattress Mike is and I don't need any furniture, but I'm going to buy a chair from him. It'd be a lot of shipping costs, but
that's servant leadership. And that's why it's hard. Physicians, we're kind of go to this calling as more of servant leaders, and to see someone that's supposed to be a servant of the public, somehow doesn't have these qualities of integrity that go along with service, this kind of leadership that we would expect of ourselves. It's kind of hard to swallow.
Yeah.
I have a question about the I'm sorry to skip in here, but this is about the hospital specifically and more related, I guess, to medicine. So what were people in dialysis doing? Like,
yeah, that's a really good question. That's a great question. So all these things I didn't think about when people were coming in. We had so many dialysis patients. So we had to, number one, work them up to see if they needed emergency dialysis. And then there was this like rush panic to see what centers were open. And we found one that was open. And then later on in the day, there was another one that opened. But we were basically admitting them to the hospital and putting them in a queue to get dialyzed based on triage. It's sort of what we sometimes have to do at county in the sense that people have to meet certain criteria to qualify for, quote, emergent dialysis. And so you really had to, again, triage queue, see who needed it the most, who was the most sick, and then admit them to the hospital. And again, it was really more kind of like I don't want to say kicking the can down the road, but it was kind of like you're admitting them, you're stabilizing them, and you're sort of putting faith that the next person is going to manage that and take care of it. It was terrifying. Yeah.
Yeah, those are things that people don't, unless you were the one that requires dialysis, a lot of people wouldn't even think of that. It's a good question. I'm glad Kevin brought up.
And also things like transferring patients too. If we didn't have, luckily this last week I was working at a big multi-specialty hospital that has all the bells and whistles. But if I had been at any one of my other places, I have no clue what we would have done if we did an ice storm like that. I mean, really, you're basically running an ER, an inpatient ward, and an ICU all together and just writing it out. And that's sort of what happened with COVID, except it was all COVID. So you were more kind of in tune on what was going on. I can't imagine all these people with medical issues, heart attacks, strokes, this and that. And you're just waiting until, storm resolves to get them out of there.
And you guys had like the trifecta, which is, power outage was one thing, having no gas, so no heat, that's another thing.
Yeah.
And then having no water, any one of those by itself is a huge issue, but to have all three of them gone, like, anyway, I was very worried about you all, and it was very thankful when Melissa was sending me texts. Oh, I'm okay. I just showered. But Yeah, and then you got a text. I don't know if you don't have to reveal, but the text that you got from one of your friends who works in a hospital was absolutely
Oh,
terrible too.
yeah. So one of the hospitals actually lost power and water, and they had to transfer all of their patients to a sister hospital.
Oh my!
So can you imagine that nightmare?
Every single patient.
I guess the ones that, I mean, really, all the ones that really needed to be there was, I don't know how many, but it was a nightmare. And they had carbon monoxide poisonings left and right. And
God.
um, I just felt, and then they're all like staying there for 5-day shifts because,
Yeah.
you know, it's really not safe to leave. And they just
Yeah.
kind of like accepted that. Like there's just nothing prepares you for that. You just do what you got to do. And, you know, you felt helpless. I think that's where a lot of, even if you cared for somebody and they're on the other side of the city, like you felt like if you left and went somewhere, you might be in trouble and then you really can't help them. And then you just sacrificed yourself. So it was a very challenging thing. I think I got to know my neighbors a little bit better because we're all trying to figure out how to turn off the shutoff valve for the water. So, you know, it didn't come on, you know, raging fast and have any burst pipes. And then we find out there's 2 different types of developers that made the houses in our street. And the ones that had the pipes burst were a company, I won't say the name, that probably put lesser quality of items in there. And the other type of builder put in better quality. That's the assumption we're making, of course. So that was intriguing. So things you find out when you have a catastrophe. When things don't seem important, you just don't pay attention until obviously things are, like how we run the grid in Texas. I think now it's going to be hard for people to have the wool pulled over their eyes.
Yeah. I think a lot of healthcare workers, I mean, don't get enough credit. I mean, they really just left everything at home, pets and leaking pipes, and just came to work.
Yeah.
You know, hoping everything would be okay. And I think, you know, they've already done it first with the pandemic and now with this. It's just like, how much more are we going to get tested on, you know, these kind of scenarios? Yes, we care, you know, like how much more do you want from us?
Do you really?
Yeah, I know.
Here's the plague of locusts. Like, we're going to actually see.
Yeah, there's that calling. I mean, people could say, oh, it's just about making money, but there's no way you would sacrifice all that you sacrifice if it was only for that.
Yeah.
No money's worth the kind of headaches and concern and worry you have for not only yourself, but those around you that you're trying to take care of.
Yeah. And I mean, even at our hospital, people came in and risked the ice and brought food and brought like clean water, and other specialists were kind of coming down to help out in whatever way they could. So like, once again, it was dark times, but it always kind of, there's a light of people, you know, showing their true colors.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's great. I'm glad. Well, we'll just see. I don't want to jinx us. You know, Texas, the one thing about weather in Texas is it's predictably unpredictable. So until I see the flowers blooming for spring, I'm just going to keep my mouth shut and hope for the best.
Yeah, and it just makes you think about preparations. I mean, just like the pandemic, I mean, these things, there was ample time. And I know people talk about policy and resource utilization. Yeah, we shouldn't always prepare for these winter storms. We don't get them that often. But at the minimum, something like salting roads, just bare minimum things that could have helped people, having extra supplies of water. I don't know, something, a few snow trucks. I don't know. I'm not a policy or government maker, but something that could have prevented how bad it was for people.
Yeah.
So one thing as a non-Texan, but just kind of the things reading about it. The reason El Paso, for one of the reasons I heard that El Paso survived so well, was apparently you guys had a freeze like 10 years ago.
2011. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 2011. And I don't get the impression
it was regional. I think it wasn't the whole state.
Okay, because then El Paso was like, oh, we don't want this to happen again, so they changed. You know, they patched into the western grid and did this other stuff.
Oh, interesting. I don't know that.
Yeah, I just, anytime we have a crisis like that, whether it is loss of, you know, the polar vortex coming down, so you don't have water and heat and everything else, or if it's a novel infectious agent that is being inundating our ERs with kind of a terrifying syndrome when we don't even know what's causing it or how it's working.
Yeah.
Hopefully we learn, right? Like, hopefully we learn from these crises so that the future, we don't have the same crisis again. We'll have new crises. But
yeah, I'd love to have an expert tell us winterized in that El Paso area for something like this. Because, you know, you think about our state, we reach 105 degrees in the summer for days on end many times. So how that would work, you know, it's not in Oregon, you don't typically have that kind of weather. So how does winterizing work in a state that reaches those kind of temperatures? That would be intriguing to see. And I don't know if there's any hesitation there, or if it's just spending the money up front for these once in a million type of, you know, rare occurrences.
Yeah.
But,
you know, the low point, I think, of that day I was working that shift was like my sister sending me a text, like, don't drink the water. And I was like, what? And I'd been drinking the water all day. I mean, you know, what else am I going to drink? And I didn't realize the water was contaminated. So, you know, I don't know how it was for y'all. Harris County was under a boil notice.
We were too.
For boiling our water. And I'm like, oh my God, like, when does this nightmare end? So I've been drinking basically fecal water, I guess, for days. Slipping around on 360 on I-10. And it's like, when is this going to end?
One thing after the other. Hey, to make a comment about your concerns about, you know, whether you had water flooding, and not necessarily that I'm promoting a particular company, but you know, those Ring alarm systems, you can connect these little discs. You can put them by all your toilets. You can put them by, you know, your water heater, certain areas of the house. It'll well, assuming you have power to your phone and to your Wi-Fi to be able to tell you, but it can alert you if there's a flood or if there's a freeze or whatever. Yeah, so it's kind of cool. Before the power goes out, at least you would know.
Yeah, some idea.
If you only have the two gone and you don't have the, you know, you still have electricity, but you don't have water and you don't have heat, gas, then that's usually.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it reminded me just back to when we were going through Harvey, just the basics. And it took us a while to get just basic groceries like eggs and bread and water in the grocery store because everything was just gone.
Yeah.
I was really so shocked when I went back to HEB. I don't know if you saw that story on HEB where basically the power went out and they were just like telling people to leave with free groceries. Pretty amazing. Yeah, they're just like, just go, you know?
Wow.
But yeah, things we just really take for granted that are available. So
yeah. And when we went to the grocery store just past week, there was still big chunks of missing areas of food that, you know, from a supply chain situation, I guess it just taken them a while. But yeah, don't want to go through that again. Hopefully we'll have some policies in place. But thank you for sharing your you know, journey in Texas.
I'm thinking we shouldn't have Rip back on because every time we schedule him, it's like there's some sort of
there's gonna be
crazy.
It's gonna be a positive one next time.
Like
it's not gonna be negative experiences. It's gonna be a positive one, and we'll have something exciting to talk about next time.
You know, it's funny, like the house, you know, the builder that built our house wasn't the most upstanding citizen. So I've been waiting for about a year and a half for the ceiling to leak. And every day, I'm telling you, I just came down and looked at the ceiling and it wasn't leaking. And one day my assistant called me and she's like, hey, she's come just doing some stuff in the house. She's like, hey, did you have a big party last night? I was like, no. She's like, why is there like stuff and alcohol all over your couch? I'm like, there's no alcohol. Nobody ever sits on my couch. So I don't know what you're talking about. And I was like, look up, Melissa. And she looked up the ceiling and there was a leak. And she's like, you're not upset? I'm like, I've been waiting a year and a half for that. You know, it was coming. So, anyway, so I was just preparing myself for coming home and just expecting burst pipes and floods and, you know, and just being like, you know what, we'll move on. It'll be fine.
Yeah.
But, you know, I think back a lot to just being close to home because my parents had a burst pipe, but it was thankfully outdoors. And I just think not even just my parents, like all the elderly that were freezing with all their medical problems, all their medications, appointments they couldn't get to, dialysis, big one, surgeries got canceled, but just managing on their own. Because unfortunately, as bad as when things like this happen, there's a lot of good people, a lot of scam artists come out and try to do whatever they can to fix it and get money out of people. So everybody move closer to your parents. That's my father's advice. Take care.
Look out for each other.
Yeah, look out for each other. Yeah, move back from London. Like time to grow up.
Or mom, you can move closer to me. I mean, that's
Yeah,
Well,
they really worried me. I mean, I don't I checked up on them and they were like just huddling up, freezing in the house, with a burst pipe outside, thank God. Thank God they had food and water. But like you were saying, Melissa, before, I was you're just helpless. And, you really feel for the people that couldn't make it in or that, and there was, I think there was a fatality, a family fatality here in Houston. I can't remember if it was a fire. It was a Vietnamese family that had it was either fire or carbon monoxide poisoning. So totally preventable, completely preventable.
Yeah. Yeah. There's been several things out there, and I think some lawsuits. There was one in Conroe, a little child that died in the mobile home. So a lot of tragedies, but I at least the silver lining is hopefully we learn from this, and don't be in your car in the garage trying to heat yourself up. That's one thing. It seems like real basic, but we don't see it happen around us. Sometimes you don't recognize the importance, but I
mean, COVID was one thing, but I mean, the most basic essentials like food, water, power. I mean, if we can't do that, what can any of us do? Which I tell my friends who aren't involved, I'm like, get involved in electing leaders that you feel understand the extent of this problem. People that believe in that thing called climate change, people that believe in these things that are really, we're going to keep feeling the effects of, because it will affect, all of our lives moving forward.
Yeah, totally agree. If Kevin, you don't have anything else, I'll take us out.
Take us out, Captain.
Okay. Well, I think it's a reminder that we are, even though we talked about the Snowzilla or a snow apocalypse or whatnot, it's a reminder of the most basic needs, like you said, Rip, that, food, water, shelter, those basic things we need, and that we really depend on everyone. It's an interdependence. As much as we like to think that sometimes we achieve and do things on our own, we really depend on a community from a local, regional, and from a national level to really live the lives that I think many of us want to live. And so I hope that all of you listening got a little piece of that during our discussion. I want to thank Rip for joining us again. It's always lively discussions, so thank you. And for those of you listening, I'm Melissa Cady with my co-host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro. And if you want to learn more about The Change Physician, you can go to theChangePhysician.com and join the community there, whether you're a physician or a physician ally. We look forward to joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on the following episode.